catching the next wave without moving a muscle. Quiet beaches, just an Amtrak away.
What's different about tonight's event is we're really going to be focusing on trying to give a sense of the Rosicrucian system of initiation. So first thing we want to talk about tonight with this concept of the Rosicrucian science of initiation is what do we actually mean by initiation or an initiate? So one of the discernment points that we have within the Rosicrucian system is that there are three different aspects of initiation or becoming an initiate. In one of these, what is actually being illuminated begins with the thinking process, with actually knowing about non-physical realities, knowing about the greater spiritual realities that we come from, and the spiritual depths of oneself. This is linked to the spiritual centers inside the head. And this is also linked to the illumination of the thinking process, so that with this process we actually know consciously the structure of the spiritual worlds, how we interact with them, how they influence us on a daily basis. And within this Rosicrucian system, that would technically be known as an initiate, someone that actually understands the systems. And that's one reason why you find in so much of the classical depictions all of these presentations of different types of patterns, one pattern within another, often represented within sacred geometric forms. And within Western Europe, often sacred geometric forms that hold inside of them Hebrew letters that are a representation of certain states of consciousness, spiritual beings, things of that kind. This is because in this path of illumination, we find that everything is a thought form from the mind of God, and all those thought forms have a pattern to them. And the current term that we use for understanding those patterns is sacred geometry. So sacred geometry is a universal science for understanding the patterns of creation at every level. And so no matter what tradition you study with, they will work with sacred geometry. Because the sacred geometry at the highest level is a pure, packed thought form from the mind of God that shows you the pure pattern of everything that's manifested from it. Now the next level is that of the clairvoyant. And from one perspective, we could say this is linked to the illumination of the heart and the feeling life. The Rosicrucians talk about a process within an initiation in which at a certain point, when the heart becomes open and unarmored, and we cultivate this feeling of unconditional love, there is an ignition of a kind of spiritual spark within the heart. And what happens then is that they describe it as an etheric rose light arises from the heart and moves up to what's commonly called the third eye center. That area that is technically at the third ventricle of the brain and was known as the cave of Brahma in the Indian teachings. This is a particular area that's open in the head that has a space between the pineal and pituitary glands. And as this space becomes illuminated, it leads to direct spiritual vision. This is then a clairvoyant. The clairvoyant can actually perceive non-physical realities. But depending upon the individual, they may not consciously understand the structures or discern the different things that they are actually seeing. So the third aspect here is that there's also the cultivation of action or of the will. And this is linked to the belly, or what in Japan they call the hara, or in Chinese alchemy they call the lower dantian, the lower will centers here. And through the action or willing form of illumination, one is able to take action esoterically. You're able to actually use non-physical realities to change things on the physical plane. Now, at the most extreme form of this, we have things like actual physical alchemy. The action or willing form of illumination, one is able to take action esoterically. You're able to actually use non-physical realities to change things on the physical plane. Now, at the most extreme form of this, we have things like actual physical alchemy and a transmutation of one physical substance to another. But this is usually attained after going through multiple steps of being able to transform something that is less dense. And that is normally etheric energy fields. So the actual vibrational transformation of energy fields, energy healing, things of that kind, is something that you find very strongly on this path. So the person that can actually transform things using spiritual forces is referred to as the adept. Now again, this is kind of an ideal type of the different aspects of initiations or initiates, often people have different parts of this in their own particular configuration and are stronger in one aspect or another. That gives us a bit of an overview for how this fits together. When you study classical spiritual text, you find that they divide up the aspects of the human being into different types of forces. So the actual consciousness of the human being is often referred to as the astral body, and it's related to what's often called the spiritual plane of the astral plane. Within the Rosicrucian work, you find at a certain point that the consciousness body of the human being has three centers that can be worked on and awakened. And those three centers are around the head, the heart, and the hara. And this is really a universal teaching. If you study with the Buddhist, they'll talk about the thought, speech, and action. If you study with Sufis, they'll talk about the head, the heart, and the hands. All these different traditions are working with the same concept. If you studied Chinese medicine or Chinese internal alchemy like Qigong, you'll know that they have the upper, middle, and lower Dantian. They refer to these as elixir fields, because when we understand what these actually are energetically, they are a kind of spiritual elixir field that we can work in and illuminate the forces of. So, depending on where we focus on primarily, we can first begin to develop the capacity of understanding things in a conscious manner, the patterns behind them, become the initiate, or directly perceive spiritual realities, the clairvoyant, or directly manipulate the spiritual forces, hopefully for a good outcome, and that's the adept. Now, first thing I would say about the Rosicrucian tradition is that the Rosicrucian tradition is one of the most recent of the great traditions on the planet. If you go back to the Vedic tradition in India, Tibetan tradition, etc., many others, they're very ancient. But the Rosicrucian tradition really only broke the surface in human history in the 1600s. But what I want to emphasize is that what we're presenting tonight are concepts related to the original European Rosicrucian impulse. It's not related to any particular central teacher, organization. We're not trying to recruit you for anything. This is really a path of direct connection to spirit by understanding spiritual processes. So it all begins understanding the whole set of processes by understanding where everything comes from. But everything comes from the unified source of the One. It's all creation from the mind of God. And in the classical Western work from Greece and elsewhere, they talk about thoughts in the mind of God being the source of everything. And that's what Plato referred to as ideal types, or ideal thought forms. These are actually what construct the world. These thoughts in the mind of God take on different separate qualities and different separate functions in the world, and then they manifest through the different planes. It's understood from the classical Western Hermetic as above, so below tradition, of which Rosicrucianism is one of the most recent expressions, that the nature of the mind of God is essentially pure consciousness. Everything is based on a field of pure consciousness. You find the exact same teaching in the ancient Vedic text and many other world traditions. Consciousness is the basis. So starting from these differentiated thought forms in the mind of God at a very high level, those thought forms have within them specific patterns. The pattern of what will later become something that crystallizes into the physical world, or the nature of a spiritual being, or a spiritual process of some type. And again, that's what we refer to as sacred geometry. So from that thought form pattern, sacred geometry level, it then moves down through the levels of manifestation to create everything in our world. And the first thing that it creates are the manifested beings. Now, the manifested conscious spiritual beings that surround us in invisible space all the time and that make up the world at a much higher level. In the Western tradition, we primarily know through terms like the angelic ranks or the spiritual hierarchies. In the classical Western tradition, there is understood to be 9 different ranks of angelic beings. So we often, in general metaphysical circles or in external churches today, hear about a few of them. We hear about the angels and the archangels, occasionally in archai. The Elohim is sometimes talked about, but not often clearly in its original form as the Elohim being one of the different spiritual ranks or hierarchies. Because the term Elohim in the original Hebrew has a suffix im, Elohim. And im in Hebrew is actually a plural suffix. It means the Elohim are a group of spiritual beings. When we have the translation from Hebrew into English of the book of Genesis, Back in 1980, I lived in Israel and studied Hebrew at a kibbutz. One of the things that was discussed is that when you get these translations from the text, the term Elohim is translated in English as God, and it seems to refer to the unitary Godhead. But the original term Elohim refers to a plurality of beings that are not the unified Godhead, but in the beginning, Elohim created the heavens and the earth, is the beginning of Genesis. And so what that shows is there's a rank of spiritual beings that were directly indicated that did the creation process. And so from the Elohim, you then have other hierarchies we hear very little about, because their state of consciousness is very elevated, but they're known in the classical text. And these are the dynamis, kyriatetes, throne, cherubim, and seraphim. 9 different ranks. And it's understood that these beings were created in a particular type of cyclical process in space and time that in sacred geometry is represented as a spiral form. So if you look at the form of a spiral, you have the completion of a circle, but as the circle is moving, it's moving either up or down. And so as the spiral is moving, it's completing a circle here, but now it's at one higher octave, and another end of the cycle on a higher octave. And so this becomes the ladder, the Jacob's ladder, the ladder of lights, the ladder of the angelic beings, spoken of in the classical text. The significance of this for us is that these different beings are of different levels of maturity, have different levels of the expansion of their consciousness, and different possibilities for action. So what is sometimes treated in very intellectual, abstract ways in dealing with angelic hierarchies was understood in the initiation circles as beings one directly interacts with all the time. They invisibly guide and affect our consciousness and life every minute of every day, but we don't perceive it, just as we don't normally have organs to perceive non-physical realities until they're developed. So again, what the significance of this is that as the Godhead has created the world, the thought forms at a very high level are given a part of the consciousness of the Godhead that in classical texts is sometimes described as an ocean of fire. So if we think of the pure consciousness of the Godhead as an ocean of fire, then there is one flame, one spark detached from that ocean of consciousness and given to the conscious spiritual beings that make up what in the West we refer to as the angelic ranks or the spiritual hierarchies. Now this is very important because it's that spark from the Godhead that is essential to understand the Rosicrucian path of initiation, because it's about igniting that spark inside the human being. Every human being has that divine core, what in the Western system is often referred to as the I am core of self-awareness, straight from the Godhead. The thing is to uncover it and to fan the flame into full activity.